Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to the first of our three daily energy crisis briefing, looking at the impact of the US-Iran conflict on the energy sector in the media. I'd like to introduce our host today and Chief Insights Officer from CARMA, Khali, who's going to take us through the presentation, and she'll start by introducing our speakers today. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Welcome, everybody, to CARMA's Energy Crisis Briefing. My name is Khali Sakkas, as Paul mentioned. I have been researching the conflict, also the energy crisis and the economic impact within media and social media since February 28. So we'll be presenting some of that research to you and talking through what stands out to us. I'm delighted to be joined by two absolute experts in strategic comms and energy. A very big welcome today to our panel members. Firstly, Frank Kane, award-winning journalist and editor-at-large at Arabian Gulf Business Insight, communications consultant to the Saudi Energy Ministry. A big expert for our panel today. A very warm welcome, Frank. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Khali. Great pleasure to be here.
And Sean Trainer, big welcome to you, Sean. Thanks for joining us again for one of our webinars. Sean is the CEO and co-founder of Salient. He brings 18 years of industry experience with the UK nuclear industry and has spent the last 10 years advising clients throughout the Middle East. He is also a technical speaker at the upcoming WPC Congress in Riyadh. A huge welcome to you, Sean. Thanks for lending your expertise to today's session.
Khali, thanks for the invite.
Excellent. Let's get started. I'm going to start by looking at the shifting and nascent narratives of the conflict. We'll then move to look at how institutions are being positioned within the energy crisis, the key themes and narratives and framing patterns that are coming through the energy crisis, the reputation risk and rewards from the way that those policy measures are being communicated. We'll look at the UAE's exit from OPEC and OPEC Plus. We'll do a deep dive in to see how that has landed. We'll also have discussion along the way. So Sean and Frank will be stopping along the way as I call you in to really give your advice, your outlook on where things stand and what you see as the next steps in this scenario. We've seen over time that since February 28, this story that emerged as a defense and politics story has really grown to become a focus on global energy. We can see here this is the impact on specific industries over time. And you can see here that especially from the ceasefire date, that energy becomes a very, very prominent part of the crisis in media. We also see obviously finance and banking and automotive and aviation playing a huge role as well, but energy crisis firmly in the spotlight. The news media is laser focused right now on the energy crisis and the economic impact. CARMA has been analyzing the lens from which we have been viewing this conflict since it began. And this lens has always favored a political lens and a military lens, but increasingly as time has gone by, the dominance and the pressure and the strain that the energy crisis is serving to many countries is becoming a primary focus. And here you can see there's a focal point in time where the energy crisis lens overtakes the military focus in media, which really shows you how central today's session is to the media coverage of the conflict and the crisis. CARMA has been looking at a qualitative element of the media coverage and social media coverage of the conflict over time. We've done this because we wanted to see what shifts, what changes as we proceed. What we've seen in news media and what you can see here is a very steady decline in the level of vulnerability and uncertainty over time. All news attention has declined over time. It's had very strong peaks over that time, but we can see news has quite literally faded in terms of the level of fear and anxiety. When we look at the social media conversation, we see an entirely different story. Let's take a look at that here. We see huge spikes in frustration and uncertainty. We see strong peaks in frustration at unprovoked aggression, and we see resilience amid crisis following those two peaks as well. What we can also see in social media amongst those audiences is that fear, uncertainty, vulnerability is higher now than it was on February 28. So you've got a lot of fear, anxiety within the public, and that's being expressed on social media. There's some interesting relationships between these three narratives over time as well. There's a strong statistical correlation between frustration and resilience. And why I like this is because it brings a very human element to this research, that when frustration spikes, resilience always follows. That's the pattern since we've seen it since early March, that an idea of we get incredibly frustrated at an unprovoked attack or vulnerable, and then there's this element on social media that we will get through this, we will get through this, we will be better as a result, we've got this. So strong resilience narratives, but always triggered by frustration. When you look at the country split of these three narratives, some interesting patterns emerge and some interesting changes over time. The one thing that jumped out to us, obviously, is that vulnerability in Asia is higher proportion than in the Gulf states. And that really connects to the impact of the energy crisis and how that is being reported and how Asia is being positioned within that reporting. Some two other shifts we've seen over time. The last time we came together, Sean, you'll real understand and recognize that we talked about the UK and the US having exactly the same profile. Since that date, UK has become a lot more vulnerable in the way that they're reporting the crisis and the conflict. We've also seen an uptick in Israel as well. So some shifts over time, and really Asia coming into the forefront in terms of vulnerability and uncertainty because of the crisis in energy. Looking now to the narratives that are probably under the radar. We're seeing rumblings of this. It's definitely not a leading narrative at all, but we are seeing some things emerging about the possible end game is not what we first believed, that there's perhaps a bigger strategic chess move at play, that Iran, Venezuela, Ukraine may be part of a wider play to weaken China from the US point of view. I'm going to stop there on that point, and I'd really love to hear from first of all from you, Frank, because we've spoken about this week. It's an interesting idea that's circulating. I'd love to hear your views.
Yeah, well, it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you so much. And can I just insert at the very beginning, I do some consulting work for the Ministry of Energy in Saudi Arabia, but I am by no means a spokesperson for them. So what you're about to hear is entirely my own view. I have to get that little disclaimer out of the way. So the yeah, this idea that there's some kind of grand strategy behind the US Israel attack on Iran, and that it's all part of a campaign to strategically weaken China by depriving it of energy supply. This has been knocking around for quite a while now. I mean, and you can see the justification because most of that oil that comes out, or that used to come out of the Strait of Hormuz in normal times, would turn east and head towards Asia, and a huge chunk of it went to the vast majority of it went to China, of course. So China is missing out in terms of oil supply big time. Now, whether that was a concerted conspiracy or not is a different matter. I mean, I don't. Some people think that Trump, plays 5D chess. I don't think he's smart enough to do that. So I think what's happened here is a kind of unintended consequence of the military attack on Iran. And look, okay, maybe it's given him some kind of leverage over China, although most of the experts seem to agree that he didn't have many cards when he went to Beijing, where he is now. But maybe it's given him a little bit of extra leverage. But I don't think that was intended. I think it's more, it's not conspiracy. It's the other one. That's my view there. But it certainly makes the whole subject far more global, doesn't it?
It brings in far more actors, and it sets a very global scene for this.
Absolutely,
Sean,
yeah.
I don't think you have strong views. I know you have strong views. Let's hear from you on whether this is strategic or haphazard. I'd love to hear more from you on this.
I agree with Frank. There's definitely unintended consequences here, but I probably sway a little bit more towards the conspiracy theory. And I would widen it out from China, actually. I believe if you look at what's happening here, it's very clear that Donald Trump is very divisive, and he doesn't like clubs or committees. He doesn't like NATO. He doesn't like United Nations. He doesn't like the EU. And I would say he feels very threatened by the BRIC economy. So if you extend the BRIC economy and its extension as the Middle East and Iran have joined that club, I see that he probably looks at that as an existential threat to his economy. You move away from the petrodollar, you start to get into all sorts of plays there. And I don't think it's uncoincident that when Iran joined that club, things started to trigger, right, with Venezuela, etc. So, interestingly, I don't think it's a direct attack at China. I think maybe the reason he's there today is to strike some deals with China. Maybe American oil is better than Gulf oil. Who knows? But no, I feel that what sits behind this is not necessarily a conspiracy, but it's just this divisive nature. I would call it a new world disorder, actually, because the whole world is in chaos, isn't it, right now? And he's been very clear to fragment any collusion or any club or any committee that might actually threaten his economy.
Trying to erode that rules-based system. Thank you, Sean. Thank
Khali,
you, Frank.
could I just add one small point there, because this is relevant for the market in which we find ourselves now, and this is the idea that there is an extension to the anti-China strategy by the US, and some people in this part of the world, I've heard this discussed by oil traders here in the Middle East. They think that Trump's other ulterior motive was to remove American energy's biggest global competitor, i.e., the Arabian Gulf oil producers, from the equation as well, to do them some severe damage, and therefore really establish U.S. energy dominance, as they like to call it. I mean, I just throw that in without any sort of valuation as to whether I believe it or not, but it is certainly a theory out there.
It's another piece of the puzzle. Thank you, Frank. Let's now turn to the global energy crisis. We're going to have a deep dive into this. I'm going to talk about what we're finding in the media, the predictions. So what we've looked at is any time that the media has quoted an analyst, an industry expert, a commentator, anytime a journalist has offered a forecast or prediction, we've analyzed that to see what that macro view looks like. This analysis includes over 60,000 media articles and social posts and is on a global level. So let's have a look at what people are predicting. I don't think any of our panel members would be surprised that the prevailing view here and for the predominant forecast is for a prolonged tight market. For within that coverage that offered a prediction, 46% was that we are set in for a long crisis. Interesting, this idea of demand destruction. You mentioned this earlier, Frank. 28% predict that to be play a very significant role in our future. About a quarter of media coverage has also predicted that we're in for a short crisis, that this is a short shock, that it will be over soon. We'll see why that's the case on the following slide. One of the things that's most interesting here, and it's a theme through all of the research that we've done, is the minor role comparatively that this narrative and predictions for an acceleration of that transition. So that transition to a green energy, 2% of coverage is talking about that. Obviously, fossil fuels offer a lot more security right now, and there's common sense behind this. But we're seeing that a prolonged crisis is on the forecast, and some of the things that we would potentially think to see be more prominent are not. Let's see this over time. So the future view, we see sharp spikes of hope, but this is largely outweighed by signals for a prolonged crisis. And here you can see this huge spike in the forecast for a short crisis following the April 8 ceasefire. Really interesting to look at the correlation between these as well. Frank, you've written recently about demand destruction. You've written an article, you've talked about its impact, and we're likely to see more and more and more of it. Talk us through your outlook here.
If anything, my outlook here has got more gloomy just over the past 24 hours, really, or 48 hours. Anyway, we saw a statement from Amin Nasser, CEO of Saudi Aramco, to go with the first quarter results, that he was looking at normality in 2027, whatever that kind of normality will be by then. And then just this morning, I read reports of the IEA, the International Energy Agency's latest monthly report, which again talked about demand destruction, supply restriction, all going to new levels. Now, the point on demand destruction, there are two kinds of demand destruction. One is the carefully planned movement towards renewables and alternatives. And this is a long-term strategic initiative taken in the light of fears about global warming, etc. That is one, that is voluntary, that is desirable. We all believe in the need to combat global warming. But the other kind is the kind that we are experiencing now, which is where, because of either high prices or unavailability of supply, consumers simply stop buying the product. And that's what's happening now. We are seeing a big fall in demand from primarily from East Asia and South Asia, also from Africa. This is because the product is becoming too expensive. It's just too expensive to buy for many countries. India and Pakistan, for example, are suffering big time because they can't afford to buy this. So demand destruction is real. Whether demand comes back when there is some kind of resolution, it's really too early to say for sure that will happen. Most of the people that I speak to think that there will be some kind of residual demand destruction, whatever happens. So that's my take on demand destruction.
Thank you, Frank, and thank you for writing about that topic and really helping to illuminate its role in the crisis. Sean, it's obviously a gloomy outlook from the IEA report this morning. What's your outlook? Is 2027 realistic from your experience?
Well, look, we've had what, 7 energy crises over the last 50 years, and they've all lasted various periods of time. I think the overarching thing for me is that there's always an energy crisis, and we just see these spikes every 10 years or so. I think this one is different. I think this one is going to change the game. My 30 years ago lobbying on behalf of the nuclear industry, the lights were going to go out in 2020. And isn't interesting, we now have a nuclear renaissance. Interestingly, nuclear always becomes favourable when the oil prices are high because it becomes more economically viable. Yeah. But I think the reality, we're in a situation today where when you look at the energy trilemma between accessibility, affordability, and sustainability, the security thing is key, right? So
it trumps everything, doesn't it?
The source of this energy and how much it's going to cost. We need it. We need to keep the lights on. So if that means burning more hydrocarbons and spending more money, we have to do it. So what you're seeing now is a shift in investment. So people are now looking at where to invest, which is a good thing because the energy industry overall has been underinvested all these years, which is a contribution to some of these tensions. So long term, yes, game changing, I think. So hopefully we can get to a position where we stabilize this and stop these, 5-year spikes and get to a point where we have a more integrated approach to energy policy, etc. I mean, Saudi is a great example of taking a long-term integrated view. Compare that to my home in the UK, which is all short-term, driven by politics and blows with the wind of public opinion. That is not a sustainable energy policy, So I think we're in here for the long term. I think it's a game changer.
Yeah, that's interesting to say that. It's interesting to look at this as something new that will have a different outcome. Thank you, Sean and Frank. I'm going to now just look at, obviously, the crisis levers. So what were the things that were determining those future predictions? Very, very obvious here. The strait needs to open. We need to see tensions ease there, but also policy reactions. So energy policy reactions by global institutions, governments, plays a really huge role in the outlooks and forecasts that we're getting through media. Demand destruction in there, LNG capacity, project delays, playing a role, but obviously a very minor one when we're looking at the levers that are driving those future predictions. We'll now look at the impact. And I think this is a section where we wanted to highlight and illuminate that this is a global conflict, and a global conflict because the energy crisis has global impact. We can see here that every part of the world is impacted, but that the impact is incredibly uneven. We can see a lot of severity throughout Africa and parts of Asia, but we can also see relative safety and relatively calm in some parts as well. So a global crisis, but a very uneven impact being felt across the globe. Let's look at a few different angles here. I was interested to see Financial Times report on Kenyan rose growers and the tea industry in Kenya. The industry has had massive financial losses in the last few months, 4.2 million just in March. Shipping costs have surged to the highest in 10 years. Some producers have lost up to 130 million rose stems. So the impact on these local communities, the impact on industries that we may not think of, very, very acute. Obviously, Asia has been positioned, as we'll see, as the exposed importer here. The vulnerability that Asia has, that Asia carries within this context is high and has been a high focus of the media. The UNDP have come out and predicted that about 8.8 million people are in danger of being pushed into poverty, and this conflict may cause about 299 billion in economic losses in the Asia-Pacific region. So an uneven impact. Asia certainly going through a lot. As we've all heard too, it's been in the headlines, jet fuel shortages have put the aviation industry in crisis mode. We've seen 13,000 flights cancelled since February 28. We've also seen some casualties in the terms of Spirit Airlines as well. So a lot of pressure felt by industries, individuals, and communities everywhere. What's interesting is when we look at the crisis response, we can see that there are people that are making their mark on the global stage that are cutting through. We are seeing some reputational risks, some rewards as well. Let's take a look at how our leaders have responded. And I can only classify the global reaction with they are buying time. And that's what we've seen over the last few weeks and months, that policy responses have favored untargeted, fast, low-cost demand reduction. We've seen fuel tax cuts. That's one of the clear patterns across Europe, Asia, Latin America, fuel caps widely in use, transport subsidies, and obviously cushioning of energy bills as well. I want to talk a little bit about this buying time and the policies that we're seeing coming out with both of you. Obviously, Asia is leading this. 9 out of the top 10 countries by the number of measures introduced are in Asia. We're seeing a lot of short-term action there. In Europe, we're seeing the most money, billions of dollars going into untargeted blanket schemes. Now, this is being criticized recently. There have been calls for that support to be more targeted towards the most vulnerable. Interesting findings. I think we'll see a shift towards more targeted over time. Sean, I'll call on you to get your assessment of, is anybody doing this well in your eyes? Do you have a view of, have you seen some case studies of who's doing it well or who you'd like to call out that should have done a better job in that short-term or long-term planning around this?
Yeah, I think everyone should probably get called out for not doing a long-term job.
Of course, yeah.
I think for me, just taking sort of one example of many, I think it comes down to fuel prices, really. I think this has exposed the fact that, American and UK and European governments get more money in taxation from petrol than actually the producing countries get from the oil.
That's astounding.
And therefore, it's about time they swallowed some of this up to protect their citizens. So when the oil prices go up, everyone looks at the oil exporters, but actually the government have a role to play to take some of that strain. And of course, they're doing that. They're doing that now. Donald Trump's made announcements recently, etc. I will refer back to case study, which I always found interesting in the 1970s, the last, the first crisis, and the response in the UK to this particular dilemma was to put rationing on how much petrol you could use. The unintended consequence of that was petrol consumption went up because everyone was queuing outside the petrol stations as soon as there was a litre went out of the petrol tank. So we took the ullage of the petrol from the tankers and put them into people's car tanks, which was crazy. The people who were criticised at the time were the Irish, because they had an opposite policy of saying, let's make a minimum purchase on petrol. The consequence of that was that people thought, I'm not spending too much money to sit in the tank, I'll use my bike. So we all looked at Ireland thinking they were stupid because they felt like they were encouraging people to buy more petrol. But the reality was, by making a minimum spend, the consumption went down. So there's a case study in history, and I only hope that for once we learn from history.
Yes, please, Sean. Yes, please. I was really interested to see Sri Lanka's response, and it surprised me, but to see that it's leading in terms of the number of measures, but it's also leading globally for the comprehensive list of measures that it's brought in. It's really implemented at pace. So you're seeing the close of public offices on Wednesdays. You're seeing universities, schools being closed on Wednesdays, switching off billboard lighting after 9 p.m. and a nationwide QR scan fuel rationing system as well. So a lot of different short-term measures trying to address an acute risk in Sri Lanka. When you look at the impact of these measures, I would have to say that media has got a mixed response, that this obviously helped them very much in the short term, but the long-term gains of this, very much a mixed reaction at this point in time. Let's look at reputation impacts. And I know this is an area where both of you have strong views and expert opinion to lend into it. This is make or break for some of our leaders and some markets. We're seeing some people rise into the spotlight and capture the mood. We're seeing others not reading the room. We're seeing short-term versus long-term policies. We're seeing some risks and rewards coming through. Some of the leading voices we're seeing globally are cutting through with these simple statements. And we always say, keep it simple. But this is one case study where I've seen that the complexity is just getting lost. And those one-liners do cut through global media quite effectively. These are not the only faces that we're seeing emerge through the energy crisis media coverage, but there's some of the voices that are shaping the way that we think and are making unique moves. So we're seeing, obviously, the IEA leader become the primary face. And that's because his tagline, this statement that is the biggest energy security threat in history, has been one of the most quoted sentences over the last few weeks. So very short, sharp messaging is working well here. We're seeing quite a lot more complexity coming up from the European Commission president, obviously a key advocate and for being not being over dependent on imported energy. And we're seeing a somewhat mixed response in terms of how the European Commission are dealing with crisis. So obviously dependency critic is the way that it's being framed at this point. The Japanese Prime Minister, being firmly positioned as in this role of the good neighbor, pledged $10 billion to help Asian neighbors. And we can see that regional cooperation really coming into play. We're seeing strong coordination between Japan and Singapore. We're also seeing strong support and liaison between Japan and Australia and Singapore. So a lot of the narrative around the Asia leaders is about coming together and being good neighbors. Obviously, President Marcos Jr. was the first to call it, the first country globally to call a state of emergency. This was, I think, a turning point for me when I realized, goodness me, he's called this, and this means that the Philippines is under severe pain and that he needs to put in very, very strict, stringent measures in place. So leaders emerging with strong positioning, but that the level of cut through here depends on complexity and the simplicity of the message. Our analysis looked at, as I said, over 60,000 media articles. And what we did was try to analyze the way that these markets are being framed. Then we looked at the patterns in that framing. And here you can see some of the major players in the energy crisis have really emerged with quite clear patterns. You can see here that Asia, the most dominant way that Asia is framed throughout the energy crisis in media is as this exposed importer, vulnerable, exposed, a growth hostage. This is coming through from Asian media, obviously from local media, but quite interestingly, it's being propelled by media in the US and Europe. So we're seeing other regions really talk about Asia in a way that is more frequent and really positioning them as exposed. The Middle East, as a general region, obviously the dominant theme here and the dominant positioning is you're at the epicenter. We're not seeing on a global scale this idea of the strategic balancer cut through. I know that it's cutting through locally, but when we look at a macro view, it's small in comparison. When we look at the way that Europe in general has come through media coverage, the most common way to classify Europe is the sleepwalker. So sleepwalking through the crisis because of dependency. And you can see it's trying to also manage the crisis. It's also trying to advocate for moral reforms and a transition accelerator. But these aren't cutting through, as well as that idea that they're sleepwalking into it with little ability to help. The UK, probably one of the most negative portrayals and framing patterns here, this idea that they're stuck in the middle. They've got a real stuck in the middle between net zero, fuel prices, trying to ease public outcry around fuel prices with no coherent, clear path out of that. Within the US, obviously the US has been central to all media coverage. We see that they've been positioned most frequently as an energy weaponizer, followed closely by that chaos agent, and we're all quite familiar with that framing. What I wanted to draw and what I wanted to discuss with you, Frank and Sean, is there hope for Asia, Europe, UK to recast themselves in this scenario? Can they reposition? You can see here that there is a foundation here in Asia that the agile fixer, the energy security advocate, it's there. Is that a foundation that they can work towards turning it around and being presented as less vulnerable? Can the UK work on this idea of the calm one guiding their population through the crisis? Can that ascend and can they get more clarity to their stuck in the middle, exposed, sleepwalking views? Really interested in your thoughts about whether I'm being too optimistic that they can recast themselves and what you think they should do from here. Maybe we'll start with you, Frank.
Yeah, it's a very interesting aspect on this, isn't it? Look, to go with the regions that you mentioned, I mean, I certainly think Asia has lots of potential to influence the future path of this crisis. India and China, after all, are by far the two biggest consumers of hydrocarbons in the world. So, what they want will bear some weight. China also has direct influence over Iran, so it can influence, the actual conflict in some way, or so it seems Trump is hoping in his trip to Iran. So certainly Asia, and Asia is bearing the brunt of this in many ways, but it doesn't have to always be the exposed importer. It does have its own measures that it can take. China, for example, banned the export of oil of all oil products. Gasoline, kerosene, etc., to outside of China. And that was regarded as an act of self-preservation, of course, but it also badly hit countries in Southeast Asia that depend on China for those refined products. China also has, 1.5 billion barrels in its strategic reserve. China can last a long time in a crisis situation. So it has all those things to play. The India, the other big one, now that that's rather more problematic because it is very exposed to energy imports from the Middle East, LNG in particular. There was one particular story that grabbed me a couple of weeks ago in Gujarat. This huge ceramics producer. I read that Gujarat is the biggest ceramics manufacturing location in the world. And one producer had to close down all production because of lack of LNG. And that involved 400,000 job losses, in one fairly impoverished part of India. So, India, therefore, is struggling with that position as, being exposed and being vulnerable. Just briefly, I've spoken a lot about Asia, I know. But let's go to Europe. I personally think both Europe and the UK are, they're like ships adrift, rudderless, on the high seas, with large waves buffeting them, the occasional tsunami coming along, threatening to knock them over. They don't really know what they're doing. I mean, look, Europe as an economic bloc, the EU as an economic bloc, certainly has combined economic power and consumption power that it could bring to bear. But they don't get their act together. The UK, outside of the EU, is very small indeed in global energy terms. It's not a big market. I don't see how it can bring any influence to bear whatsoever. So stuck in the middle, I mean, stuck in the mud, really. The US, well, certainly weaponized energy. But I mean, Iran also has equally weaponized energy. Yeah. So
exactly.
So that's where we are.
Sean, from a communications angle, is there hope here for repositioning, recasting for any of these two, UK, Europe? Can it be done?
They'll try their best, obviously. But I'll refer back to the famous quote. You can't talk yourself out of a crisis that you walked yourself into, or in this case, sleepwalked yourself into.
Yes.
So it comes down to action, really. And as tempting as it is to look at these in isolation, I can't help but think, the energy system is a global system, and each of these are players in that. And my only hope is that we go back to the concept of building trust, which comes through dialogue, which comes through collaboration, working together. And although, the economics on energy is very parochial, every economy has a different formula, etc. There is a global picture here. And unfortunately, the point I made earlier with this divisiveness isn't really taking us to that point where the world get together. This is why the World Energy Congress was formed, 100 years ago. And here we are 100 years later, almost going in reverse. So I want to avoid sort of, how do these different players reposition themselves, and talk more about action and hopefully building trust. The other point I would make is that where we've always had this kind of global south, global north thing, we're starting to see a global west thing emerging now. So we're marginalizing different economies and nations, as Frank mentions, India with 400,000 tons as an example, but it's changing again. It's changing the whole dynamics, and I only hope, because the question was, is there hope? I only hope that people start putting their heads together on this global crisis.
I'm not going to help your mood here about hope, Sean, because the next couple of slides we're going to talk about a clear divergence from coming together. We're going to look at the UAE's exit of OPEC and OPEC Plus. Sorry to do that to you, but let's look at how this announcement landed. Obviously, the concept that you've talked about, Sean, about fragmentation, about the dialogue coming a monologue, this is all obviously feeds into this. The UAE's exit, obviously we saw, this is showing global media attention. It peaks with the announcement, and then it subsides after that. The chart on the right is showing where that global coverage came from. We had two things that really helped this being major global news. It is in its own right, but the media were already looking at this region. We were already covering UAE, and we were already covering this industry. So there's something about the timing here that is absolutely critical to the success and the visibility of this announcement. Obviously, it is major global news in its own right, but there's a masterclass here, I think, of landing messages and timing. What we did is we analyzed coverage of that announcement in tier 1, tier 2 media, so that the primary media globally in each market, where we found an opinion expressed. So where there was a clear view, we analyzed that and captured that. We captured whether the decision was criticized or doubted. We also looked at whether that decision and announcement was endorsed and supported. And you can see here that overwhelmingly, that announcement, 75%, the media was on board, and that support focused on the strategic autonomy elements, the flexibility over quotas messages really cut through, and we'll see that on the next few slides. Obviously, the next step in that equation is, well, how did OPEC fare within that coverage? Again, you can see here that of those articles that expressed an opinion either way, 91% was negative or criticized OPEC. So we're seeing some warning signs here. We're seeing some red flags go up. I would also like to caveat this slide by saying most coverage did not offer opinion. We saw a lot of this balanced factual reporting on the announcement, but of those that had a view, it was quite decisive. Let's have a look at what cut through. What are the leading themes that cut through in this announcement? 20% of coverage focused on this concept of strategic autonomy, closely followed by flexibility over quotas. And you can see here that these key themes were really adopted by global media. Key themes, if you look at some of the elements in this chart, we can see that OPEC fragmentation is a huge part of the way that this landed. 7%, I think about 7% or 5% looked at it as the beginning of the end for OPEC. Obviously, this fits into this fragmentation idea. I'm really keen to hear both of your thoughts on how you thought this landed as a comms announcement and what you see as the next steps from here. Where do we go from here? Maybe start with Frank.
Yeah, it was really, it was a bombshell, wasn't it? Right in the middle of a lot of bombshells. And people were surprised by the timing. Why do it now when oil markets are so volatile? And the UAE's rationale was that that's the very reason we're doing it. Oil markets are so volatile that our individual decision to leave OPEC will therefore not affect oil markets very much. And some people swallowed that, and there is an element there that you can understand. You can rationalize it that way for sure. But the longer rationale that came out, primarily, I thought the best explanation of it came from Yusuf Al-Otaiba, the UAE ambassador in Washington. Who talked us through the need for the UAE to move past oil dependency, to produce and sell the stuff while it was still valued, and to reinvest in the UAE's strategic infrastructure, digital, AI, data centers, all that. That also came across very well. I would just make a couple of points. I think that the positive reception for the UAE's decision to leave OPEC Plus, reflected the unpopularity of OPEC and OPEC Plus in Western media. That's Absolutely. A very big factor here. I think everybody will have noticed that there was no official announcement or official reaction from Saudi Arabia or indeed from OPEC itself. So that tells you the kind of other side of the story. There is a longer term strategy being worked out here by OPEC and OPEC Plus, and I think we have yet to see that. The other smaller point is that it also kind of reflects the corrosive nature that Russia has when it becomes a member of any international institution, in my opinion. OPEC pre-2016 was a Saudi and UAE dominated organization. Suddenly Russia comes in, and that puts people's noses out of joint. I don't think much coverage was on that, but I think that's a very valid factor here.
Sean, is this signaling the end to you? What are your thoughts in terms of next steps? Where do we go from here?
I agree with everything Frank said. I can't help but look at the parallels between this and Brexit. The UK leaving the European Union. The only difference is there wasn't a referendum, thank goodness. So this decisive and very strategic move to move away, I think, speaks for itself. But to Frank's point, OPEC Plus especially, is a bit like the EU in that it was perceived as a failed project, perhaps. Yeah. However, both of those entities, they were created for a reason, right? So whatever your views are, whatever happens, something needs to take its place, right? So there was speculation that UK or even the European Union would be the end of the European Union. Well, we've not seen that, have we?
No.
And I don't think this signifies the end of OPEC or OPEC plus. But to Frank's point, I'm sure there's a strategy as to how this evolves into something different, perhaps. But let's not forget the reasons why it was created in the first place, and that stabilizer effect, I think, is important. And of course, the UE can say, well, it doesn't really matter at this stage. So if things are so volatile, we may as well move away. But in the long term, let's see what happens. But I don't think OPEC and OPEC Plus will disappear. And if they do, it will evolve into something else. That would be my view.
Watch this space. Okay, thank you. Thank you both. Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk through what the takeaways for communications are. Obviously, there are some broad lessons to be learned with this research. There's many angles here. There's winners, there's losers, there's a lot going on, and we've got 6 takeaways for PR and comms that I'll talk through. We'll then open it up to a broader discussion. If we've got any questions come through, obviously our panel members and myself will answer the Q&As as well. So let's walk through the 6 things that we think are evident from the research that we've done, but also make sense to not just energy industry players, for governments, for any brands that are navigating this world of uncertainty and chaos. First, and you mentioned this at the beginning, Sean, that this idea of trust and this fragmenting of trust is a central theme. I think the antidote to that is looking at empathy. Consistency becomes very, very important. Precision level planning becomes absolutely essential. So they're the overall themes that we're advocating for, but more specifically, you saw how the high levels of vulnerability and uncertainty are creating this really challenging comms environment. And we're saying that especially audiences on social media, you could see that chart. They're frustrated, they're angry, they're anxious. Social media campaigns need to be well thought and well planned, given that climate. A renewed focus on empathy, a renewed focus on the individual impact is probably going to land better than anything else. The individual lens has been lost through reporting of the conflict and the crisis. Secondly, and we see CARMA works with a number of global organizations that offer us a masterclass in how to do this. The impact is acute and very uneven. So ensure that global announcements are passing those local context and local cultural tests. So we often see very strong relationships between global HQ when a campaign is activated. We are saying that strengthen those ties, strengthen the ties between global, regional, and local teams. The news will land differently in most markets, more than it ever has, and make sure that there's message consistency with regional and local and global. Number 3, earnings announcements. We've seen with the clients that we support, they've become well-oiled machines. These are media productions that offer us a lot of what good looks like, I think, in terms of media and comms. For most organizations, especially in the industry, there will be a larger audience at your earnings announcements for the foreseeable future. The statements, the language, the choices of language, the nuances will be so much more critical. Winners will need to navigate potential backlash. Losers will need to also present a believable, realistic outlook to the markets and to the media. So we're offering a very specific look here at really making sure that you're understanding the narratives of who the winners and who the losers are and how those results will land. And we're seeing that play out over the last few weeks with major oil companies releasing profits, doing very well with that. I think there's been some very good examples of that, but it's something to really proceed with caution. The next three that we have are really about opportunities and an approach of de-risking your comms. Number 4 is about discipline and delivery. Trust is built over time about doing what you say you will do. So walking the walk, talking the talk, making sure that your behavior matches the language of your brand and your organization. In an environment where there's vulnerability, uncertainty, fragmentation, audiences will need to see that trusted behavior, that consistency, that discipline from your organization, from governments, and from brands. So a focus on that discipline would probably land quite well. Number 5, something that I don't often advocate for, but having analyzed many articles and looking at some campaigns recently, there is a certain strength in silence. So given the level of sensitivity, given the heightened levels of frustrations, we're seeing some of the biggest brands hold back on activations. And I'm saying that that's probably a very, very smart strategy for now, because there is a very high risk of backlash. There's a high risk of disconnect with communities that have got other things to worry about. So while proactive media we have seen working very, very well for some, our recommendation is to proceed with caution. The last one, and we saw that the energy transition, that the predictions that this will accelerate our energy transition, only 2% of all predictions are focused on this. We're seeing two things here with the communication around renewables. One, we've got a visibility problem. Communication on renewable options needs to become much louder in global media, but it also critically needs to address security, energy security, and supply issues in order to cut through and in order to have a believable influence on those narratives. There's some of the takeaways that we see emerging from this data set and how the media is positioning the energy crisis. I wanted to pass obviously over to the panel and then to our audience. But I wanted to talk about winners and losers and how we're communicating winners and losers. Sean, I also wanted to hear from you about, are you seeing any brands or organizations doing well with proactive campaigns? Is there any examples that you think you can communicate in this chaos and do well? I'll pass to you first to talk about if you've got any examples of that.
I think it's a good summary of the 6 points. Discipline is always key in a crisis. But I think the missing point, perhaps, Khali, is budgets, right? So there may be a lot of intent to do stuff, but there may not be either the availability or appetite to spend, because it might be seen as being frivolous, etc. And one of those examples I will bring, it's a very small one, but a very important one, I think. Clearly, and Frank mentioned the Indian redundancies, there are a lot of companies that will be going through redundancy, and that always requires sensitivity.
Yes.
And there was a really nice example from Careem, which we know is the sort of Middle Eastern equivalent of Uber, where they had to lay off people, obviously, because the demand's gone down for taxi services and no tourism, etc. And they came out with this lovely sort of campaign to say, we've got these really high talented individuals that need work. It'd be a shame if you didn't sort of tap into this. So they, rather than be the victim or be the villain because they've had to pay off people, they sort of came out in a sort of hero way to say, we value these people. Unfortunately, because of circumstances beyond our control, we have to let go. But please, you'd be foolish not to pick them up if you're looking for great talent. And I just thought it was a really small but really nice example of how to handle a sort of redundancy situation.
Gee, that's a masterclass, isn't it, Sean? I mean, that's exceptional. To get that right, to land it well, I think, that's a very, very strong example. Thank you. Frank, winners and losers, right? There's known winners, there's clear losers. Oh, where do you see that playing out? And what are the implications for comms and media?
Yeah, sure. I loved your point about the strength of silence, because comms is not always about shouting the loudest. It's about knowing when to not shout at all. And I think people, and certainly here in the Middle East, are taking this lesson to heart now. I mean, mainly because of the uncertainty. We don't know what will happen. We don't know the timeline. We don't know what the eventualities are for opening the strait, basically. So therefore, why say anything until you have more certainty on that? And I think, that's why we're seeing people talking vaguely about Q4 as being the time when all these postponed liquidity events and, forums and summits will all come together. But they don't really know. So they're not saying for definite, So I think that talks to your point. In terms of losers, and you touched on this with the renewables lobby. No, my personal view is that they really have lost from this, because for a long time, this goes back to the demand destruction debate we had earlier. But for a long time, some of the more extreme elements of that kind of lobby have said just stop oil. Well, now we're seeing what happens when you just stop just 20% of oil. It is economic chaos. The promises to get worse. So I think that they have to work on their messaging, a lot better. You cannot be so extreme and definitive as just stop oil anymore. It has to be a far more nuanced, taking into account the economic importance of hydrocarbons in the global setup. So that I think that they are a big loser from this, and they have to work on it.
Has the opportunity been lost, Frank, or can something still be made from this? Can they turn this around and have a stronger voice that takes into account that huge issue of energy security?
Well, I think they can. The imperative is still there. We are all aware of the importance and the need to tackle global warming. So, the imperative is there. And the hydrocarbon producers, increasingly, I know from working in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, both of whom, invest an awful lot of money into the energy transition aspect of this. They are working on it, effectively. So I think if the renewable lobby, the energy transition lobby, the green lobby, for want of a better word, if they were to take some lessons from the people at the sharp end, i.e. the hydrocarbon producers in the Middle East, if they learn something from them, then that's a worthwhile exercise for them.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you both. Paul, we're at time, but I'm sure if some people can stay on the call, we've got time for questions from myself and the panel. Have we had anything come through the chat? Is there any burning questions for us?
Yes, thanks, Khali. Conscious of time, but let's start with the first question. I think it's probably the fairest way to do it. So we've had a question in from Alan Freeman. He says, can you expand on the impact on the natural gas / LNG sector for the Gulf and wider Middle East region following the conflict? And do you see other geographies diversifying away from LNG?
I will pass to Frank and Sean for that. Frank, do you mind taking this one?
Frozen.
On LNG?
Me?
Yes. Did you hear the question from Paul?
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
Okay.
And look, it's a really interesting question because we didn't talk about losers, but one of the biggest losers in terms of economic impact in the Gulf was Qatar. The biggest LNG producer in the region and one of the biggest in the world. So if the question is about the impact on LNG in the Gulf, then certainly it has been serious and impactful. Qatar says it will lose 20% roughly of its production, and it'll take 3 years to repair. Ras Laffan will take three years to repair. Now that may be, slightly over pessimistic, but that was the official response, and that's a serious prospect. Will the rest of the world reduce its dependence on LNG? Well, I don't think so, because prior to this crisis, LNG, was being presented as the bridge fuel between dirty old hydrocarbons like oil and coal, and the new renewable future. And I don't see why, once this is over, that can't be the way again. Certainly, Qatar has to do something about its infrastructure. It has to find a way to get LNG out of the Gulf without having to go through Hormuz. So that it probably involves some fairly big pipeline investments. But I don't see why the rest of the world. It's a convenient. Price varies, of course, but it's a good alternative to oil. So I don't think the appeal of it will decline once this crisis is over.
Yeah, I mean, I think it has its appeal, and I think you're right, Frank. But I will go back to the dependence on LNG in the UK, where it was a response to not being dependent on Russian gas. They probably would want to switch back now, I would think, maybe, who knows. But whatever the outcome, the key factor here is the supply chain, resilience and security of supply. And there's going to have to be, we've mentioned this before, there's going to have to be a lot of changes in infrastructure, in supply chain management. And what comes out the other end will be a mix, and we'll see where it lands. But I think we're always going to have a dependence on LNG, just like we're all for a long time we're going to have a dependence on dirty hydrocarbons. But the answer is, again, taking a long-term strategic view to ensure that security, and then we can start thinking about affordability and sustainability. But let's keep the lights on first,
Just one further point here, if I could, which didn't occur to me before, which is, of course, that we are now becoming dependent, even more dependent, on American LNG.
Absolutely.
The US is jumping in to fill the gap that has been created by the attacks on Qatar. And I think in April, for the first month in history, Asia bought more LNG from America than it did from Qatar. First time ever.
Donald said it, didn't he? He said, our people are saying, actually, we quite like your oil. We quite like your LP. Maybe we'll start using it.
I mean, this fits in with my conspiracy theory about them.
Yeah, 5D chess, I think, Frank. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Oh, this is 8D chess. He's so smart. Yeah.
Paul, have we got another question, or would you like to wrap up? Where are we?
We've run quite well over there, Khali. I think we've got a series.
Let's do this. Okay.
The ones we've got, we can answer offline, and I'll send them to you. But on that, I'd like to say thank you very much to you, Khali, to you, Frank, and to you, Sean.
Pleasure.
For a very interesting and insightful discussion. I hope that everybody who joined us, wherever you are in the Middle East or Asia Pacific, enjoyed us, and we look forward to welcoming you onto one of our future webinars. Hopefully by then the war will have ended, and we're talking about the impact of it post-war rather than during the crisis. So thank you very much, everybody.
Please.